Where are we today, Phil?
At the top of Runaway Lane.
Runaway Lane?
Runaway Lane.
Now that's the name, isn't it?
That's it there. Just behind MODBURY Church. To the east of MODBURY Church.
Now what happened here?
Well, this was the end of the fighting. So what happened before that was I've already talked about the first fight at MODBURY in December 1643, when Hopton withdrew from Plymouth after his men were routed here, the Devonshire royalists were routed and all their leaders captured, Hopton withdrew from Plymouth to besiege Exeter. He couldn't take the city, so what he did, he withdrew back across the Tamar into Cornwall, came across the moors back into Cornwall, and refitted and retrained his men and waited reinforcements in payment. in the January 1643, the Earl of Stamford moved into Devon to assume command, and he planned to attack Cornwall, attack the royalists in Cornwall, using Ruthven's men and his own army. So what he did, he stopped in Exeter and sent a message to Ruthven, wait for me, I'm on my way, and we'll invade Cornwall together. Ruthven didn't wait. He was champing at the bit, especially after his earlier victory at MODBURY. So he took a small army from Plymouth, moved into Cornwall, pursuing Sir Rolf Hopton's Cornish army, who withdrew towards Lostwithiel. Hopton suddenly counterattacked him, moved forward, and at a battle known in the Civil War as Braddock Down, or Braddock Church, he beat the Roundheads on January the 19th, 1643. He scattered Ruthven's army. Ruthven withdrew to Plymouth with his survivors. He'd lost all his artillery, his wagons stuck in the mud. The battle was fought, they say, at Braddock Church, but it was somewhere in the Liscard area between their Tap House and Braddock. Nobody's really sure at the moment. There is research being done on that. Stamford arranged with a man called Colonel James Chudley and his father, Sir George Chudley, to amass an army from all over Devon and from outside. They brought together a force of about 7,000 to 8,000 men at Totnes. These later moved on to Kingsbridge. In the meantime, after beating Ruthven, Hopton recrossed the Tamar and laid siege to Plymouth again in the early part of 1643. Hopton was worried when he heard this news, especially after what happened to his forces in December. So he sent 1,500 to 2,000 men to MODBURY to keep between Chudley and Plymouth. The rest of his forces he stayed outside Plymouth, blockading the port. In the middle of late February of 1643, Chudley and his father began their advance towards MODBURY to relieve Plymouth, MODBURY being the first stop. In Plymouth, they received a message to move out with a strong force and attack MODBURY from the east. So the town would be captured by two armies moving from opposite directions. The Cornish royalists under Sir John Berkeley were two regiments, Trevanians and Sir Nicholas Slannings. These 1,500 men heard about the attack from Kingsbridge and moved to high ground a mile southeast of MODBURY, where they threw up a rough earthwork, a breastwork if you like, a line. When the Roundheads advanced from Kingsbridge, they were in a long stretched out line. So Sir John Northcote, who commanded the advance guard, moved up to the hill but didn't have enough soldiers to really take on the Cornish, but he skirmished. They opened fire. The two sides fought for hours. More soldiers came in along the road. More Roundhead soldiers took up positions, but the Cornish held their positions for hours. The men of Plymouth didn't show up at first. They left late. They leisurely marched towards MODBURY. They ransacked Fleet House on the way. They stopped to pillage a near empty house of anything they could find, because people, like I said earlier, always seem to ransack baggage wagons and whatever they found. There's a house, attack it. This slowed their advance. The Cornish royalists, Hopton didn't send reinforcements. He just left them to it. He knew they were disciplined soldiers. These soldiers were trained for the last 6 months. They've been trained by Hopton. They were a good small army, and it held up the Roundhead advance for hours. In the end, lack of ammunition and not seeing any reinforcements coming to join them, the royalists pulled back into MODBURY. The fighting continued. The Roundheads, with daylight fading, set fire to houses and lit up the battlefield. There was looting. Some soldiers broke away. It wasn't an organised attack. Soldiers broke off to plunder and loot and attack people. Others just chased the royalists wherever they went, followed them for miles. Most of the royalist army withdrew towards the Champernowne mansion, and fighting started to get flared up there in what was left of the old house after Ruthven's raid. Eventually the Plymouth men came up, made an appearance, and the royalists decided it was time to go. So they broke off and made an orderly retreat back towards Hopton's main force around Plympton. The Roundheads from Plymouth joined in the plundering of Modbury. Some of the survivors, they said, ran down this lane, which is now called Runaway Lane. It was called Runaway Lane because they said all the soldiers ran down here from the two fights. But it was an organised... it hasn't changed much at all.
And they must have been pretty slippery.
Yeah.
If it was a wet...
It was February.
It was February.
So it was cold and wet, and they must have thrown their muskets away. Soldiers throw away stuff to make their rut, to get away, yeah.
Yeah.
They went down to the brook.
Here. It's only width for like 3 or 4 people.
Yeah,
Isn't it?
and it was a little bit smaller than those days, probably deeper.
Deeper, of course.
Because it was a main road. But at the bottom is Aylesbury Brook. Aylesbrook. And that would have slowed them for a minute, no more. They would have ran off and then dispersed. But most of the Cornish soldiers went back to Plymouth. Now, because of this, Hopton broke off his siege of Plymouth again and withdrew. So the Battle of Modbury, although it's not in Plymouth, it had a significant effect on Plymouth as the Civil War progressed. There was 2 fights here, and both of them were successes for the Roundheads. Not great battles, as battles go, but fairly substantial, and it made the Royalists withdraw, so it did help us in a way, and it opened up the South Hams for trade, because Plymouth had a lot of its supplies from the South Hams, from the farms here, and people in the area didn't care who really, except for the nobility, the normal people didn't care who was in control, as long as they could sell their wares, because it was their livelihood.
Fascinating, Phil.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.